I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 93rd episode in this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is an episode that I have been looking forward to doing for a long time, and this is a conspicuously non-pharmaceutical episode. This is an episode that the information in which would have been useful to pretty much anybody who's ever lived in the time since the invention of sheepskin condoms. And if that sounds like a weird date to set, that'll all make sense in a minute here. Our guest in this episode is Dr. Gordon Gallup, who is a researcher into human sexual strategies, mate selection, pair bonding, evolutionary psychology, all that stuff. And I heard about his research maybe for the first time about 2-3 years ago, and my jaw hit the floor, and I expect it will probably hit the floor a few times for you during this interview also, because he has found compelling evidence that, as outrageous as it sounds, it also kind of sounds obvious when you think about it in retrospect, that human semen apparently has significant antidepressant properties when applied to a human female. That's going to be what the main interview is about. This is a very adults-only episode of Smart Drug Smarts. We're going to be talking about all kinds of stuff. Penises, vaginas, semen, the whole deal. So if you're a 10-year-old kid that stole your parents' MP3 player and is listening to Smart Drug Smarts, it's time to turn yourself in and not listen to this episode. But for the rest of you, this is going to be a super interesting one. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, we're going to keep it on theme in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, and I'm going to tell you when you should plan your vacations if you are a stripper. Not sure how many strippers we have in the audience, but just in case, that'll be waiting for you at the end. But to kick things off, as usual, let's start with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So there's that old standby of science fiction and mad scientists where you've got the live brain floating in a jar, and of course, that is not something that science has done to this point, but apparently they're getting closer. Scientists at Ohio State University have recently announced that they've got what is the equivalent of a 5-week-old human brain that they've grown from scratch. It's about the size of a pencil eraser and is engineered from adult human skin cells. They say that it's the most complete human brain model yet developed, apart from those within actual humans. There have been previous attempts at growing whole brains, but they've achieved at best mini organs that have only completed parts of the brain, not the entire thing. Renee Anand from Ohio State University says, "We've grown the entire brain from the get-go. Now, you might be wondering about the ethical concerns. This is not a conscious brain. There's no thinking going on here, and in fact, there's no sensory data going into the brain whatsoever. So it's really just a bunch of flesh at present. It took about 12 weeks to create the brain that resembles the maturity of a 5-week-old fetus, and to go further would require a network of blood vessels that the team cannot yet produce." Says Anand, "We'd need an artificial heart to help the brain grow further in development. This could eventually have dramatic effects for personalized medicine, but for right now the team says that they're focusing on using the brain for military research, particularly understanding the effects of PTSD and traumatic brain injuries." But for those of you who want to put on your tinfoil hats and talk about the military using brains in jars, there's at least now a kernel of truth, apparently an eraser-sized kernel of truth, to that statement. Very pleased to say that we picked up a couple of 5-star reviews this week on iTunes. Listener Gallosat said, "Very informative, love it. I love the episodes where you interview folks that are experts in a certain area and dig down deep for the truth on what works and how." Dance said, "This is my favorite podcast on the interwebs. The format is terrific, the guests are top-notch, and Jesse is simply brilliant at hosting. All I can say is thank you." Aww. And if you would like to leave an iTunes review, there's a quick and easy how-to to be found in the menus of smartdrugsmarts.com, where you can also do cool stuff like sign up for our email mailing list, or find some of the non-audio content that we put up on smartdrugsmarts.com, like an article that I did last week, riffing a little on that old chestnut of a question about the ethics of the use of nootropics and cognitive enhancers, whether it's quote-unquote like cheating in sports with steroids. If you want to read me going on a little bit of a rant, that's also up at smartdrugsmarts.com. Finally, happy to mention that there's a couple of Know Your Neurotransmitters episodes coming down the pike, seem to be in the very, very near future here, next couple of episodes. A lot of people have asked when we're going to be continuing that series. We've done dopamine and GABA so far, and luckily we are nowhere near running out of neurotransmitters to cover. There's a whole lot of them. But yeah, be on the lookout for a couple more episodes within that series soon. going to canvass your opinion for just a moment. If you've got a favorite Smart Drug Smarts episode from the past, maybe it's one that particularly stands out in your memory banks, maybe it's the one that got you hooked, maybe it's the one that you've gone back to and re-listened to a couple of times, I'd love to hear what that is. You can drop me an email at jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. This will have a little bit of bearing on the episode number 100 that we're putting together for a few weeks from now. I think that's the end of October, and might also have some impact on a secret project that I haven't quite revealed yet, but will probably reveal in the next week or two once I get my ducks in just a little bit more of a tidy row. But either way, yeah, if you got a favorite episode from the past, would love to hear about it. Finally, I'd like to give a shout out to everybody that's been trying the Axon Labs products over at axonlabs.io, of which Smart Drug Smarts is a proud partner. We've got 2 supplement stacks over there, Nexus, our cognitive stack, which we talked about last week on the episode with Abelard Lindsay, and Mitogen, a mitochondrial enhancer stack, that along with fish oil is the one thing that I do absolutely every single day of the week, except on the occasional fasting days. Those are over there at axonlabs.io. They're starting to seed out to some other places on the internet too, some other retailers that are starting to buy those for resale, so that's cool. If you're seeing those Axon Labs products pop up in other places on the internet, that's probably a good thing. But the horse's mouth is definitely our website. You can find the link from smartdrugsmarts.com. You can type in axonlabs.io directly. If you haven't yet given those a try, I would definitely encourage you to check those out. It's a big help to us here at Smart Drug Smarts, and something that I'm proudly throwing down my own gullet on a regular basis. But now let's move on to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So in this interview, I'm going to be speaking with Gordon G. Gallup, who is a professor of psychology at the University at Albany, which is a state school in New York. Over the course of a long career, he has worked with everything from self-recognition in primates to the evolution of intelligence and human reproductive competition. We're going to be talking specifically today about human reproductive competition and some little-known but incredibly interesting psychological warfare that men have apparently been doing on women since the dawn of time, and we are just now starting to realize. So I've got 2 caveats before this episode. One is that we're going to be talking constantly about semen. So if that's a subject that you're not comfortable hearing about, this is probably not the best podcast for you. You can plug your ears with some wax or come back next week or whatever. And the second caveat is that, unfortunately, we have some pretty bad audio on Dr. Gallup's end of the phone call. It was a regular phone. We weren't able to use Skype this time like we normally do. And although he's understandable, it's just not quite as clear as we would like. I really apologize for that. We weren't able to work out a technical solution that was going to allow us to do this interview in any sort of reasonable time frame. So we just figured that we would go forward with it. And hopefully you can cut me just a little bit of technical slack on this one episode. So with no further ado, Dr. Gordon G. Gallup.
I'm an evolutionary psychologist. I'm interested in the impact of evolution on human behavior, and I focus primarily on human reproductive competition for gaining genetic representation in subsequent generations. And a number of years ago, we became interested in a phenomenon called menstrual synchrony, which occurs under conditions in which typically cohabitating women discover, after having lived together for several months, that their menstrual cycles are in sync. And there's been quite a bit of research that's been done on this. Not all cohabitating women show the effect, but of those that do, it appears to be mediated by olfactory cues. So if you take women that don't live together but expose them to body odor samples of one another on a daily basis, not uncommonly they will become menstrually synchronous. And in reviewing that literature, we discovered that lesbians, unlike heterosexuals, don't show menstrual synchrony, which seemed very peculiar because cohabitating lesbians would be in much closer, more intimate contact with one another on a daily basis than heterosexuals would. And it occurred to me in thinking about that difference that what distinguishes sexually active lesbians from sexually active heterosexuals is that lesbians are having semen-free sex, whereas heterosexuals that are sexually active may be being inseminated, and being inseminated could have metabolic, biological, and biochemical effects that may affect odor production. So we got into the literature and began looking at what was known about semen and semen chemistry, and it turns out that 95% roughly of the ejaculate consists of what's called seminal plasma. Only 5% of the ejaculate contains sperm. And if you extract the sperm, you're left with seminal plasma. And it's a very complicated concoction of biochemicals and hormones and all kinds of different things. And it turns out that within an hour or two after unprotected sex, you can detect elevated levels of some of these seminal chemicals in a woman's bloodstream. So some of the ingredients to seminal plasma pass through vaginal epithelial tissue and get into the woman's bloodstream. And once it's in the woman's bloodstream, it can obviously have far-reaching effects. We discovered an article that was written in an obscure journal by an MD who was seeing a female client and treating her for depression. And in the course of the treatment, she became romantically involved with a man. And shortly thereafter, her depressive symptoms went into remission. And the MD speculated that might be a consequence of the possibility that semen may have antidepressant properties. So that then prompted me to think about ways to conduct a more rigorous and more compelling test of this hypothesis. And it occurred to me that women that are having sex with condoms represents a nice, albeit not perfect, but a convenient control condition. Women that are routinely having sex with condoms are having semen-free sex. So you could compare women that were having unprotected sex with women that were having protected sex with condoms. So we conducted a survey of just shy of 300 undergraduates and determined whether they were having sex or not. It was obviously an anonymous survey. For those that were having sex, we partitioned the sample into those that were having protected sex and those that were having unprotected sex. And when we had these females fill out what's called the Beck Depression Inventory, which is kind of the gold standard for measuring depression, and it's used by a lot of psychologists that are seeing clients that they suspect may be depressed, that those that were having unprotected sex had lower scores, significantly lower scores on the Beck Depression Inventory than those that were using condoms or those that weren't having sex at all.
And this is a test where you want to score low. So low score means low depression.
Low depression, correct. And so depression didn't vary as a function of whether or not they were having sex. It varied as a function of whether or not they're being exposed to semen. And the obvious question at that point, well, how do women that are having unprotected sex differ from women who were having protected sex? And we looked at all kinds of things. We looked at whether they were on hormonal contraceptives, for example. We looked at whether they were in a committed relationship. We looked at how long they'd been in a committed relationship, and none of those variables made any difference in terms of the obtained differences in depression scores for those who were having protected sex and those that were having unprotected sex.
It really turns on its head the notion that the relationship itself, like the psychological aspects of the relationship, might have a mediating effect on depression.
Exactly, and that's, I think, been the bone of contention ever since we reported these effects originally. We've subsequently replicated the effects on a larger sample of about 1,000 co-eds and have found basically the same thing. But there's this gnawing suspicion that somehow women that are having unprotected sex may be fundamentally different in some way from women that are having protected sex. And one way to disentangle those possibilities is to think about semen as a concoction of features that evolved to produce a lot of different effects. One way to think about semen is that semen evolved to transform the female reproductive tract into a user-friendly environment for sperm. If you think about some of the ingredients to semen as the equivalent of drugs, you would expect these effects to be temporary. They should be time-bound, right?
Right, because you want to benefit your own sperm and not somebody else's that might have sex with a woman a couple hours or a couple days later.
Exactly. So we looked at depression scores as a function of the amount of time since their last sexual encounter. For women that are using condoms, it makes no difference whether they had sex the night before or they haven't had sex for a week. For those that are having unprotected sex, it makes all the difference in the world. The longer it's been since they've had sex, the higher their depression scores are. So the effect is clearly a time-bound effect. It's not a reflection of some underlying fundamental trait difference that distinguishes women that are having unprotected sex from women that are using condoms.
How long does it take a woman who is having semen-exposed sex to sort of drop back to her depression baseline? Like, what's the half-life of semen emotionally?
The effect pretty much disappears after 4 or 5 days.
Gotcha. Wow. So you said you've replicated the original study. Are you doing follow-ups or looking to do follow-ups to explore this further? I mean, it's such a fascinating topic.
Well, let me describe some of the effects that we've discovered in this subsequent study.
Sure.
Inspired by the fact that the effects of semen are time-bound, we began to think about semen withdrawal. And under what kinds of conditions would sexually active females experience semen withdrawal? Whether they're using condoms or not, many people abstain from sex during menstruation for a variety of reasons. And a common side effect of menstruation is the premenstrual syndrome. And part of this premenstrual syndrome for many females includes periods of depression. So menstruation represents a period of semen withdrawal. And lo and behold, there's an increased risk of depression. Same thing is true for the postpartum period. For a woman who gets pregnant and has a baby, it's typically recommended that she abstain from sex for 6 to 8 weeks after the birth of the baby. So the postpartum period becomes a period of semen withdrawal. And indeed, the postpartum period is a risk factor for depression. It's called postpartum depression. Same thing is true for menopause. Following menopause, the frequency of sex, and therefore the frequency of insemination, oftentimes diminishes. Many women experience the loss of elasticity in vaginal tissue, and intercourse becomes painful, etc., etc. And one of the problems with the post-menopause period is an increased risk of menopausal depression. Still another condition, and probably a more common condition, of semen withdrawal would occur under conditions in which a woman is in a committed sexual relationship with a man and there's a breakup. Those that were having unprotected sex are far more profoundly affected by the breakup than those that were using condoms. Indeed, the risk of what's called the rebound effect, so following a breakup, how long does it take for the woman to become sexually re-involved with another man? The risk of the rebound effect varies as a function of whether or not they were using condoms in their previous relationship. Those that were having unprotected sex begin having sex with other men much sooner after the breakup than those that were using condoms.
What's the scale of that difference between the two groups?
It's an order of magnitude that involves a period of weeks for women that were having unprotected sex and months for women that were having protected sex. So, it fits. It's not conclusive, for heaven's sake, but it's consistent with the idea that semen may have antidepressant properties.
Now, in these studies, you haven't really done the work to find out what the active ingredients, there could be, I guess, so many in a biological substance like semen, but do you have any idea what it is that's promoting these effects?
There are all kinds of possibilities, but nobody has actually tried to isolate what may be the critical components to semen. Conceivably, if you could identify what was mediating these mood-altering effects, assuming that you could substantiate that these mood-altering effects were due to semen exposure, then you could create semen suppositories, synthetic semen suppositories that could be used for purposes of modulating mood, I suppose.
The strangest antidepressant ever. I'd love to see that commercial.
The other interesting parallel between semen as having antidepressant properties and drug effects is route of administration. For many different drugs, the effects of the drug vary as a function of the means by which they're administered. Well, in the case of semen, there are probably about 4 options. There can be oral ingestion, it can be administered topically, it can be administered vaginally, and it can be administered anally. And the question would be, do the antidepressant properties of semen vary as a function of route of administration? The corollary question would be, do the antidepressant properties vary as a function of dose. If you don't ingest the semen, the dose is going to be less than if you ingest the semen. And I always thought, thinking about this initially, that the ingestion of semen may destroy many of the mood-alterating effects. They may not survive the digestion process. But I've been persuaded otherwise. And the two bits of evidence that exist to the contrary are, and this is probably the strongest, is that birth control pills are taken orally, and steroids and birth control pills survive the digestion process quite nicely. The other is a recent paper that appeared in a journal on reproductive technology that shows that women who regularly ingest their partner's semen have a significantly lower risk of developing preeclampsia if they become pregnant.
Can you define preeclampsia for us?
Preeclampsia is a pregnancy problem that emerges at about 15 to 16 weeks. It's a pregnancy complication in which the fetus fails to undergo a second phase in the implantation process. And as a consequence of this failure, it doesn't get enough oxygen and it doesn't get enough nutrients. And so it sends signals to the mother, biochemical signals to the mother, and it increases hypertension on the part of the mother, and frequently the fetus will eventually die. And the risk of preeclampsia is lower among women that regularly ingest their partner's semen, suggesting that there are things in semen that in fact do survive the digestion process and lead to important biological consequences.
So that would be somewhat counter to what you were saying earlier as far as the acute effects or the short-acting effects of semen and making it a friendly environment for the sperm. That would be something that would be a multi-month chronic effect.
Precisely. The chemical composition of semen is pretty much the same from one man to the next, but there are subtle individual differences. Every male has what you might think of as a semen signature. And some of the best evidence for this is that a change in paternity is a risk factor for preeclampsia. So if each man has a semen signature, then there's the question of semen familiarity. And upon initial insemination, the female reproductive tract treats seminal fluid as a pathogen. It consists of a lot of foreign proteins, and it triggers an immune response. Males have evolved semen and components of the semen that function as immunosuppressants to counter this immune reaction. And therefore, over the process of repeated insemination, not only does the female's reproductive system develop a tolerance for that particular male's semen, but she also becomes immunocompromised as a consequence of the immunosuppressant properties of semen. And that may be one reason why condoms are so effective when it comes to preventing the spread of sexually transmitted diseases.
To go back to something that you said earlier about a change in paternity being a risk factor for preeclampsia, is a change in paternity putting somebody at equal to or greater risk than a first-time pregnancy?
It would depend on how long it takes for her to get pregnant. If she conceives on the first encounter, then it's going to be pregnancy as a byproduct of unfamiliar semen. But as the frequency of insemination goes up, then she develops a tolerance for the male's semen. And that tolerance then translates into a reduced risk of preeclampsia. One of the biggest risk factors for preeclampsia is artificial insemination, which typically involves single exposure to unfamiliar semen.
What's so interesting about these studies is that it has so many sort of implications as to what our biology expects us to do within human-to-human relationships that we think of as being psychologically governed. How long would it take for a new relationship that is sort of at the ground zero sexually before this preeclampsia risk would drop as low as it's going to drop?
I don't know that anybody's established the parameters, the temporal parameters of that, but it's interesting to think about semen familiarity as kind of a basic biochemical algorithm that could be used in the ancestral environment for assessing the willingness on the part of the male to enter into a long-term relationship with the female that would include provisioning and protecting of the female and her dependent children. And women that are being routinely inseminated by the same male are more likely to be in committed relationships than women who are inseminated on a less frequent basis. So you can think of artificial insemination as the equivalent of rape, a single exposure to unfamiliar semen. In between rape and honest courtship, which is a committed relationship, is what's called dishonest courtship, where males feign good intentions for purposes of gaining sexual favor. So it takes the form of, I love you, so let's go to bed. So you have this dimension of insemination frequency that would distinguish males along a likelihood of making a committed long-term bond with a female that would work to her reproductive best interest. And preeclampsia, therefore, might be Darwin's morning after pill. It might be a mechanism that serves to terminate a pregnancy that may not be in a female's long-term reproductive best interest. So what might seem like a medical disaster may be indeed a blessing in disguise.
Yeah, if an ancestral or a cave woman was raped by a male from another tribe, it's probably best to assume that he's not going to be there to raise the child afterwards.
I think semen chemistry may be part and parcel of courtship and mate selection. Let me give you some background that'll put that in perspective. We've done some work on kissing, and one of the things that we've discovered is that the majority of people have had the experience on one or more occasions of finding themselves attracted to someone only to discover after they kiss them for the first time that they're no longer interested. So that first kiss can be a make or break proposition when it comes to the future of that relationship. And if you think about what happens during the first kiss, there's a very complicated exchange of information in terms of postural adjustments and body odor cues and the exchange of saliva, et cetera, and there may be hardwired evolutionary mechanisms that decode all these cues to make a determination about, based on the health and fertility and the genetics of that other person, whether continuation in this relationship would be in your long-term reproductive best interest. Well, there's a parallel to the first kiss and semen exposure. I think that semen sampling was an integral part of courtship in the ancestral environment, and in many instances, even into the present day. So that in the process of dating and becoming familiar with a variety of different males, females may also sample the semen from different males. And there may be mechanisms operating at the level of female reproductive physiology that decode the information contained in the ejaculate of different males to make a determination about the health and fertility and the genetic compatibility of that particular male as a long-term partner. So following insemination, you either wake up the next morning head over heels in love, or you wake up the next morning with feelings of regret for what you did the night before. Now, at the other end of that continuum is a condition called seminal plasma hypersensitivity, where females who are exposed to semen show an exaggerated, what appears to be allergic response, and it's accompanied by rash and painful genital side effects. And I suspect semen hypersensitivity may have evolved to terminate a relationship that would otherwise not be in a female's reproductive best interest because of the lack of a good biochemical genetic match.
Yeah, that seems like that's a deal breaker in any relationship.
Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that the antidepressant properties of semen are huge. It's a statistical effect. And I think the effect is more pronounced for some people than for others. And that gets me back to the semen sampling idea. We've had a number of people who've run across our research contact us by email with different kinds of semen testimonials from females who have switched from condoms to unprotected sex. And some of them experience dramatic changes and dramatic antidepressant effects. Others don't. And I think that may be a reflection of whether or not it's a good match. We've also had semen testimonials from females whose committed partners have undergone vasectomies. And within a period of months, they develop depressive symptoms, suggesting that being vasectomized may change semen chemistry.
What follow-on studies would you like to do now? Are there nagging questions that you have that you would still like to get answers to?
Well, the real problem at this point is that you can't, because of ethical considerations, you can't manipulate semen exposure under laboratory conditions. So, the data are correlational. There's no question about it. But I think in many respects, some of these effects are consistent with the idea that semen may have mood-altering effects. But, it hasn't been demonstrated conclusively, nor will it any time in the foreseeable future. But it's food for thought, and it leads to all kinds of other interesting speculation and hypotheses, as we've seen in the course of our conversation.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much for taking the time for that interview to Dr. Gordon Gallup. Obviously, the ethical, social, and personal implications of a lot of the topics that we covered there are really, really profound. I thought that the single most interesting part of that conversation was that there was no statistical difference in the Beck depression scores in the women who were not participating in sex and the women who were participating in semen barrier sex. Which essentially I take to mean that on average, having a boyfriend doesn't make these college girls any happier than not having a boyfriend, which flies in the face of conventional wisdom and all of our love songs and cultural assumptions, and isn't that something? Anyway, a ton of great info in there. That one's probably worth re-listening to just to make sure that you didn't miss anything. But now, as promised, and as usual, the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So if you remember a few weeks ago, we were talking with Dr. Molly Crockett about a study that she did showing that a few common drugs that weren't really intended to do such things were causing changes in people's tendencies in ethical decision-making, in moral decision-making. And I kind of feel like we're starting into a little bit of a meta theme, or at least this is something that I'm becoming really interested in personally, looking at how our decision-making processes are inadvertently altered by things that are going on all the time, whether they're drugs that we intentionally put into our system or just things that we do that's altering our physiology in ways that has these unsuspected effects that are actually taking place all the time. So this ruthless listener retention gimmick is about an instance like that. There was a study done in 2007 that found that female lap dancers, I don't know if there are such things as male lap dancers, there probably are, but found that female lap dancers made 80% more on tips during the fertile phase of their menstrual cycle than they did when they were menstruating. Dancers who were on their normal cycle earned approximately $335 for a 5-hour shift when they were ovulating, only $260 per shift in what's called the luteal phase of their menstrual cycle, basically the part after they have released an egg, and only about $185 during the same time period when they were menstruating. And as if that weren't enough, naturally cycling lap dancers made more in tips regardless of where they were in the cycle compared with those women who are taking hormonal contraceptives. This opens a huge number of questions about why such variation in tips was taking place. Obviously, the patrons at a strip club aren't going to know whether a woman's menstruating or not, but the possibilities offered by the researchers included that perhaps the women were more sexual, they had greater energy, and or that they changed their vocal, physical, or olfactory cues during their most fertile period, and that men found these fertility signals alluring. But yeah, $335 versus $185, that's an 81% difference from something that seems like it would be completely invisible on the face of it.
Smart Drug Smarts. We get you thinking.
Okay, that is the entire episode. If you enjoyed what you heard, please tell a friend. Anything you want to do, whether it's showering us with Facebook likes or iTunes reviews or Twitter tweets, all of it is dearly appreciated. If you're telling them about this specific episode, you might want to forewarn them that this one's a little bit more risque than our average Smart Drug Smarts episode. The show notes for this episode will be online as usual at smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that I talked about here, and I'll be back at you next week, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your very own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not. And the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.